In this lesson, we will take a look at one of the cool benefits of functional programming. Specifically, we will play with higher order functions. We all know how to create functions like this one, that doubles the number that you give it. But, did you know that you can assign a function to a variable and then use it? Now, higher order function is just fancy terminology for a function that either accepts a function or returns a function. There are many higher order functions that we use daily, like array map, reduce, filter, and so on. Array filter, for example, accepts a function that handles the logic on which items to include in an array. Here, I have an array of characters where each character has a name and an attribute specifying if he is a bad guy or not. In order to create an array with only the bad guys in it, we'd use filter and keep the ones whose bad guy property is true. So here, we pass a function called callback function that checks if the character is a bad guy or not. We could also assign the callback function to a variable and use it like this. Here, the filter method creates a new array with the characters that pass the isBadGuy test. The benefits of using higher order functions are that the code is reusable and you write less. And when you write less code, the quality is usually higher, and it's easier to prevent bugs. Though the array filter doesn't make these advantages clear. So, let's see how we can benefit from using higher order functions in our applications. Here is a function, fetchResource, that receives two arguments, the name of the resource and the ID. And then it returns an AJAX call. So, in order to fetch a user, for example, we can call the fetchResource function and give it the resource, which is users, and the ID of the user that we want. Instead of using that every time we need to fetch a user, we might want to create a fetchUser function that will accept the ID of the user to fetch. Then we can reuse fetchResource by passing it the name of the resource, which is users, and the ID argument. Now, if we run fetchUser3, it will fetch the user with the ID of 3. That's good, but what if we wanted to have functions like fetchTheater, fetchMovie, fetchTicket, and so on? We would have to create each one separately. Using higher order functions, we can create a function that produces other functions. This way, we will be able to create the fetchTheater function by writing something like this. To show you, I will create the makeFetcher function that will accept one argument. This argument will be the name of the resource that will be included in the URL. For the fetchTheater function, for example, the resource would be theaters. makeFetcher has to return a function. This function will also accept a parameter, and this parameter will be the ID of the resource that we want to fetch. For the fetchUser example we ran before, the ID argument was the number 666. In the returned function, we want to call fetchResource and pass it the resource and the ID. Now we can create a fetcher function like fetchTheater. Notice how the returned value is a function. Now, running fetch theater3 performs an AJAX call to the /API/theaters/3 and returns a promise. This way, if we make changes to the fetch resource function, because, for example, the URL from the API changes, we don't have to update the rest of the functions. Some might want to perform the AJAX call directly inside of the makeFetcher function, but I prefer to extract it for testability. It also makes more sense to me to go and update fetchResource instead of makeFetcher when, for instance, the API routes change. I hope you're excited about using higher order functions in your projects by now. They're great for composition and reusability. Before we move forward, I'd like to show you how all these look using arrow functions. The fetch resource function will look like this. It accepts the resource and the ID as parameters, and then it uses the resource in the file path that is being called, and the ID in the file path as well. Then, makeFetcher accepts the resource, and it returns the function that accepts an ID and returns the result of calling fetchResource, passing the needed arguments. There is no difference on how we use the functions to create fetchers, so fetch users will remain the same.